Welcome to English Speaking Made Easy, and in this episode we are going to begin with the Grammar Express. In the last episode we were discussing pronouns. We told you about what a reflexive pronoun is, what a possessive pronoun is. The idea behind telling you these things, in technical terms, it might seem confusing, but there will be but unless we introduce that, we may not be able to give you certain vital tips that you will pick up from that. The expectation is not that you remember all these terms. The expectation is that when you learn these pronouns, there will be lots of errors which we point out, which will make sense to you and which you can correct. We are going to continue with our topic on pronouns, and we are going to speak about what we call relative pronouns. Okay? Like all other pronouns, the function of a relative pronoun is also to refer to the noun which has been mentioned before. Okay? That is exactly how a relative pronoun works. But here the relative pronoun also introduces a relative clause or introduces an adjective or a relative clause. So, what happens is they will usually appear or they are positioned after a noun. What a relative clause or what a relative pronoun does is it gives you some additional information about a sentence. Now, you will understand this, and this one pronoun, the reason why it has been discussed in detail is it creates a very big error which results as a result of wrong punctuation when we use the relative pronoun, and that is why I have decided to focus on this. A relative pronoun, like I said, introduces a relative clause. Okay, now you might be wondering, what is a relative clause? A relative clause is something, it's something which adds on additional information about the subject. The normal relative pronouns we have are words like who, which, that, whom and whose. What happens is there are only a few relative pronouns in English, so then the rules are also not so many. Okay, now along with these relative pronouns, we also add there are a few other pronouns also which can serve as few other words which can also offset a relative pronoun. In some situations, these words what, when and where can also function as relative pronouns. Now, when I'll give you a few examples so you can actually understand what is the function of a relative pronoun. Okay, so you keep that in mind, and it's as I mentioned before, it is very, very important that you know how to use it appropriately in writing. So, relative clauses are typically introduced by relative pronoun, and that is the pronoun which can function as a possessive pronoun or as an object of a subject. Okay, we can leave all that, just remember it introduces a relative clause. When you introduce this relative pronoun, there are two other words which are important here. One is you have something called a restrictive relative clause, and you have a non-restrictive. Now, that is another new word, that is another new thing that you need to perhaps just understand it in its simple terms. A restrictive clause and non-restrictive clause are not very difficult to understand. The terminology is confusing, but how they use it in a sentence is not very difficult. A restrictive clause is something that actually introduces one part of a sentence that contains some vital information about the sentence. So, you cannot remove a restrictive clause from a sentence. On the other hand, a non-restrictive clause only provides additional information. Okay. So, what happens is in a non-restrictive clause, even if you remove that particular portion, it will not affect the meaning of the sentence. But if you remove a restrictive clause, it will not convey, the meaning of the sentence can be altered. So that is the difference between a restrictive clause and non-restrictive clause, and the reason we are actually bringing those two expressions is that they are that this is always related to how we use a relative clause. So in order to avoid that confusion, I have given you so many words. Now you might be wondering what these things mean. It can be very clearly explained with a few sentences. Look at this example here. The astronaut who first stepped on the moon was Neil Armstrong. Okay, here the relative clause is who stepped on the moon. See, I told you all relative clauses in a sentence begin with who. So in this case, the astronaut who first stepped on the moon is Neil Armstrong. Now what happens if we take out who first stepped on the moon? The sentence will be the astronaut is Neil Armstrong. Is the sentence wrong grammatically? The sentence is perfectly correct. But what happens if you take out that vital bit of information? The astronaut who first stepped on the moon. The sentence misses out on its core element. So that particular portion is what we call a restrictive clause, because if you remove it, the sentence meaning changes. So that is how we use a restrictive clause in a relative pronoun. So we say a restrictive clause can also have a limiting function. Another sentence here. Children who eat vegetables are likely to be healthy. Now we have another relative pronoun here, who eat vegetables. That is the who introduces the clause there. But here also, if you remove who eat vegetables, the sentence's meaning can change. Grammatically it can remain the same, but the intended limits, that is the children who eat vegetables, that may be lost. So when you have sentences like this, or when you have clauses like this, we call them restrictive clauses. So non-restrictive clauses, like I mentioned before, provide additional but optional descriptions. Okay, they can be removed from a sentence without altering its meaning or structure. We'll just have a look at one sentence here. John, who just graduated from high school, is an accomplished footballer. Now here also you see the relative clause, a relative pronoun, who just graduated from high school. But in this particular sentence, just try removing that bit, who just graduated from high school. When you remove that, it doesn't affect the meaning of the sentence in any way, because the only idea we want to convey is that John is an professional, he is an experienced footballer. So whether he just graduated from high school or otherwise does not add or take away meaning. It does not change the impact of the meaning the sentence is expected to convey. So even if you were to say John is an accomplished footballer, it still means the same thing. So here we have a non-restrictive clause, which means a sentence where even if that core clause is taken away, it does not affect the meaning. Now the reason why I am telling you this is the punctuation, which is very important in writing. There is a problem when you use a non-restrictive and a restrictive clause. The first thing is, in a restrictive clause we don't use a comma, but in a non-restrictive clause the that particular clause is demarked by a comma. Like for example, when we said John, who just graduated from high school, is an accomplished footballer. Now the additional information in a non-restrictive clause, we single it out by a comma. So after John there is a comma, who just graduated from high school, there is a comma, and then follows the rest of the sentence. So in such non-restrictive clauses, a comma separates the removable part of the sentence. And this is one thing which is very important when you write, because you will see that most people do not realize that that needs to be demarcated with the comma. But a restrictive clause on the other hand, you do not need to give a comma. The sentence flows by seamlessly without commas. Okay. So, for example, would you lend me the textbook that you recommended last week. It's a restrictive clause, there is no comma. Okay, because that you lent me last week, you can't remove that bit from the sentence. So, there is no comma to separate it. On the other hand, if you look at this sentence, Oliver Twist, which was Dickens's second novel, is a classic. Here we have put a comma after Oliver Twist, we have put a comma after novel. That is a removable part. So, Oliver Twist is a classic is all that you need to know. So, in a non-restrictive clause we put a comma. So, we get that. So, it is important to understand that one bit to help you punctuate yourself well in writing, and this has been specifically brought in because this is a very common sentence construction and one area where punctuation often goes wrong in the written speech. Well, of course, when you are speaking, it does not really matter because a comma does not figure when you are speaking. So, it may not be of such concern, but in writing this is a very, very important thing. Okay. Now, if you notice, we have both in American English, the relative pronoun whom is very rarely used. You may notice this in conversations, but when you are writing, whom has a place in academic writing, and to make your sentences grammatically correct, you might need to use a whom. Now, let us look at this one. What is the difference between, what do you call the confusion between when do we use that and which? When do we use the word, the relative pronoun that? When do we use the relative pronoun which? Now, actually, what we've noticed is that in American English they have a specific rule. In British English both are used interchanged, but in American English there is a different rule for that. What they do is Americans use that when they want to introduce a restrictive clause. Now, we mentioned what that is before, and they use which when they want to introduce a non-restrictive clause. Just remember that. So, you might see that used differently in American writing, and so for example, the lamp which was given to me by my aunt Betsy is on the bedside table. So, it is a non-restrictive clause and they have used comma. The lamp that Aunt Betsy gave me is on the bedside table. There it is a restrictive clause and there is no comma. In British English, however, it is often acceptable to substitute which in restrictive clauses too. So, just that one small bit of information there, because it is Americans who have a strong demarcation on where you use a that and where you use a which. Okay. So, the basic thing you need to remember here among all the things that we mentioned is that when you use a relative clause, it is used to introduce a relative pronoun is used to introduce a relative clause, and the words we use are which, that, who, when, where, all those. Okay. These are all relative pronouns, and that there is something called a restrictive clause and a non-restrictive clause. It is important to know that because in writing it has an impact on punctuation. Okay. So, I hope you have got that bit ready for you. The next set of pronouns are interrogative pronouns. Now, interrogation means questioning. So, these words introduce questions. So, the examples are all very similar. I mean, these words are very similar to what you call the relative pronouns also, but what happens is the function is different here. So, now I hope you have got to understand what a relative pronoun is, what an interrogative pronoun is. Slightly confusing, but then it's go by the examples and that will make it clear for you. Now, we are moving on to our second section, which is lexica, your guide to good vocabulary. In this section 2, we are going to continue with the expressions, the gestures people make. So, here we are now going to do something with the facial expressions that you would make, especially with your eyes. Okay? There is one expression called wide-eyed. Wide-eyed, as the name goes, is wide-eyed. It is meant that this is an adjective we use when we want to describe someone's face, when they have their eyes completely open. So, if you wonder when do we actually have that expression, it is when we are totally shocked or amazed by something, our eyes open up completely. So, it is called wide-eyed to describe that particular action by our eyes. And an example is, when we got off the bus, we were immediately surrounded by friendly, wide-eyed kids. So, here it means that the kids haven't, perhaps small town kids who haven't seen so many people dressed up like this and their eyes wide-eyed. Anything you see which shocks you, which surprises you, your eyes pop out. You know, wide-eyed kids. And then sometimes we can also use it like this. Is that your real hair? She asked me, wide-eyed. Okay, that's the expression there. The next one is squint. Squint. Squint means when you close your eyes about 80%, not completely, but 80%, especially when there is some bright light coming towards you, okay, and you've just gotten out and there's some bright light and then you cannot completely open your eyes and look at it. So, it closes 80% and that's when we use the sunglasses, when there's lots of bright light coming in. So, you squint. That means you close your eyes about 80% like that because you can't handle that bright light coming towards you, and that word is called squint. Squint, okay, and it normally happens or on a sunny day when you've forgotten to take your sunglasses. The next word we have is a sideways glance. Now, people looking through the corner of the eye, both to the sides, okay. This means you are actually seeing what is happening on the side without moving your head that side. You look just moving your eyes to the sides, and a sideways glance can either be positive, sometimes it can have a negative thing. When you're slightly suspicious of someone, you're suspicious of someone, you don't trust that person, and then you might look sideways, but you can also look sideways in a very playful way. So, there are two ways that we use our eyes sideways. That's called a sideways glance. So, that's one other expression that people have, people use with their eyes. So, we have wide-eyed, we had squinting, and we had looking sideways. I will give you an example for this. I caught his sideways glance and immediately knew he didn't want to work with me on this. So, that means that his sideways glance made the person feel that, I don't trust him so much. He doesn't want to work with me on this. So, it's called sideways glance. She cast him a sideways glance. That means anything which is referring to suspicion or in a playful way. So, it's called a sideways glance. So, you see a lot of people do use these kind of eye gestures. The next expression we make with our eyes is we roll our eyes. When do we roll our eyes? We roll our eyes when we either think someone is being stupid or annoying. Okay, so you say, so I went to the embassy to report my stolen passport, and the guy there just rolled his eyes at me ridiculously. When you feel people are being stupid, you say roll your eyes. Okay, the next word is wink. Wink is when you quickly close an eye and open it again. So, that is when you call wink, when you close one eye and you open it. This means that you wink in a very playful way sometimes. It can mean slightly different things in different contexts. In different cultures also, the wink has a different significance. Generally, when someone winks at you, they are either basically saying that they are on your side. Yeah, I'm with you on this, come on, we're on this. Sometimes it could even mean that, sometimes could mean something different. It could mean don't worry, I won't tell anyone. So, wink can have it can have different meanings in different contexts. Okay. So, those were the words we had. So, just take it on from the beginning. We had rolling your eyes when you feel someone is acting stupid or someone is being annoying. Then you wink when you close one eye and open it quickly. Then you have a word called squint when you have bright light at you, and then you have wide-eyed when someone is surprised, and then you look sideways, looking sideways when you don't trust a person or sometimes in a playful way. So, you will see people actually indulging in such kind of gestures. So, you know what they mean and what these words are, how they are expressed in English. Now, we are moving on to our third segment, That is, let's say it right, your guide to good pronunciation. I've got a few random words for you. One is the difference between the pronunciation of two words. CLOTH is always pronounced cloth. Adu verum thuni, that's cloth. When this cloth is made into a dress, then it's called clothes. CLOTHES. Without stitching it, it's called cloth. Then you make clothes out of that. So, in the first one, the word which you hear there is th. The second one is clothes, the. And you have a z sound at the end. So, it's cloth and clothes. Okay. The next word is a person who works with you is your colleague. Okay. COLLEAGUE. The person who works with you is your colleague. It's your colleague. And that's how you pronounce that word. Now, we look at another word that is there, and if you want to make it colleagues, that's how it comes in, and it all has a z sound at the end of it. Your colleagues. Now, now next word that is important is the word February. Now, many people drop out one R. They say February. It's not February. There are two R's there, and this particular month you have to pronounce both those R's. So, it is like February. February, both the R's are pronounced there. You can't drop an R. In some words you drop an R, but in this one you definitely need to have both of that coming in. Okay. So, then the similar word is library. Library also has two R's, both the R's need to be pronounced. Library. You can't drop an R there. Okay. You have to say library. Okay. Now, these are some random words which we chose for you, some words you could correct if you are mispronouncing. Okay. Now, we are moving on to the next section. Let's talk your guide to good conversations. So, here I have not actually got you a conversation. I am going to make this into a conversation next episode. Here I have just got you some expressions that you can use when you want to give directions. People ask you where you are going, people ask you how to go to a certain place, what kind of expressions you can use to tell them. Firstly, when you are giving directions, we use an imperative form. That is, we say, we use words like, that means the imperative form is very short and you just go to the point, something like this. Okay? You tell a person directly what you have to do. Here are some examples of when someone asks you how to go somewhere, how do you generally give instructions in an imperative way. Okay? So, the first one is you would say, take the blue line, continue going straight, turn left. This is how you give directions. These are the imperative sentences you use to give instructions. Similarly, when you are speaking or in polite speech, that is in formal polite speech, it is often, you might not use it normally, but in giving directions it is kind of appropriate when you do that. Now, when you want to ask directions, you would ask questions using how. How combines with many adjectives that way. So, when you want to ask someone information about where you need to go, you would begin sentences with how. Some common sentences with how. Okay, they would be like, how long is used when you want to speak about the length of time. How much is used to speak about the price of something or the quantity of something. How often is used to speak for how repetitively something happens. So, now we are just taking the bit related to giving directions. Now, there are a few important grammar and vocabulary nouns to remember when you are asking for directions. Is it far? Is it close? I would like to go to so and so place. Is it far off or is it close? The next question would be, how far is it or how close is it? Another question type, where is the nearest supermarket? So, these are kind of expressions that we use when we want to give directions. Now, what I am going to do is I have just kept this particular portion for today. What we will do is in the next episode, we are going to see a dialogue, an actual conversation which includes all these parameters. It includes all these words, so it gives you a better conversation practice. Okay, so that we'll see in the next episode. So for now, thank you, and I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we'll hope to see you next time.